are finishing up the ancient covenants. And really, these ancient covenants begin in chapter 3 with the patriarchal covenants given to Abraham. And what we find are that God gives these covenants first to Noah, and then they progress all the way to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then they come to the nation of Israel. And we find with these covenants that each covenant reiterates and upholds the previous covenant. No covenant is ever rescinded over a course of 1,000 years. If you want to take it from Noah to the nation of Israel, every single covenant is upheld. No covenant is ever rescinded or anything really changed in it drastically. And I say drastically because there are a few minor changes between the Sinai covenant and the Moabite covenant. So we do find some changes there, but nothing that is that drastic or foundational. They're minor tweaks in application. We find that all the philosophies stay the same. So what I wanted to start with, we are going to start with the Sinai covenant. And 2 weeks ago, we were on chapter 4, and we finished all the way to, let me get to the right page here. We had finished all the way to page 140. I'm sorry, no, that's not right. No, that is right. Okay. Yes, we did. We finished all the way to page 146. So we were finished all the way to page 146. So tonight what we're going to look at is this idea of 10 precepts. We find that similar to modern covenants, Israel's covenant begins with the historical preamble and then a historical prologue. And, you know, God is very giving. A lot of people want to take the God of the Old Testament and make him into something that is very totalitarian, something that is very top down, and something that is not a entity that is not responsive to the people. And we find that that is not the case, because in this covenant, God wants to impress the people that he's real, that he exists, that he's not like all these other deities where you go to their temples and you bow down, you worship them, you have all these acts of service that are really service to the priesthood, and you're supporting this entity of the priesthood. There's really no personal benefit out of it, really, with these priesthoods. Yes, they redistributed some wealth, as the priesthoods did, and they had some sustenance, and they granted some employment to their constituents. But by and large, it was really a people-supported, a citizen-supported entity that took in and really did not give out near as much as what it took in. So you find with Israel's covenant and Israel's form of government that it was really much different. We find that when God wanted to make this impression on the people, that he was actually speaking to the people, that it was him that was revealing himself and his way of life to Israel. He comes on the Mount Sinai with trumpets and sounds and thunders and lightnings to make this huge impression. And the people get scared. They say, whoa, this is too much for us. This God is something that we don't relate to. It's very scary. Will we live through this? So the people ask, and they say, please do not talk to us, Yahweh. They don't want God to talk directly to them, and they ask for an intermediary, and that intermediary ends up being Moses. So rather than talking to God directly, they do go with a leader, but God respects their decision. He does not force himself on Israel. He respects that they would rather have a human talk to them, and he issues that, and he includes that as part of his covenant. So if you look at Exodus, it's going to be 20 verses 18 through 20. God accepts this self-imposed injunction, and he does not try to subvert it in any way. We also find that the blessings of this covenant are conditional. They are the if-then. If you will do this, then this will happen. And what it's really displaying is this idea that the covenant itself contains a formula. It contains a way of life, a philosophy that is beneficial to humanity. It is something that if you follow it, these are the natural consequences. Uh, if you detract from it, or if you take another path and you do not follow it, well, then we find that you cannot achieve those blessings because they are achieved through a certain way, through a particular form of life. We also find that following this paradigm, this constitutional paradigm, produces a people that are a very peculiar people. They stand out among the nations. They're not the same as the Edomites or the Canaanites or the Mesopotamians or the Egyptians. They stand out as this like beacon of liberty and freedom amongst all the other nations. They have not only have liberty, they have the ability to have a voice being heard in their community and in their society that really was not heard in other ancient nations. You find that it's very comparable if you look at what America has become the last 100 years, with how America has stood out as this beacon of hope, this beacon of a better way of life, of a way of liberty, of a way that everybody wants to come to. Everybody flocks to America. If you can get to America, then you've made it, because there is not, historically, there has not been that governmental oppression and that government that holds you down and holds you under their thumb. And with Israel's government, remember the entire covenant where Yahweh reveals himself, says, I am Yahweh, your God, that delivered you from the house of bondage. So the entire covenant is founded on this idea of coming out of bondage, of liberty. And again, that liberty is established by placing controls on government, which included the priesthood. The priesthood had very firm controls placed on them. Their land was limited, number one. Their income was dependent upon the people's obedience to the covenant, so that kind of gave them an incentive. The monarchy was also limited. So you had all of these checks and balances. You had a representative republic with the Adah, which we will look at when we get into chapters 5 and 6 and 7. We will see that this representative body actually spoke on the people's behalf, and they represented Israel within their constitutional government. So, and really America, I would say, has come very, very close. I would say 85%, and this is subjective, but within 85% of reaching this paradigm that is established at Mount Sinai. And America has achieved this paradigm and reached this state of freedom and liberty because it is founded so much and grounded on the Sinai Constitution and later the Deuteronomic Constitution. So we have a lot to be thankful for with our founding fathers. So Exodus 20, it's very interesting because we find that every time Yahweh speaks to the nation of Israel, he reiterates, he incorporates those words and those promises that he has previously spoken to his people. So in Exodus 3:20, and guys, just so if you want to follow along, right now I'm working directly on page 147. So we're looking at the table 4.2. So if you want to follow there, if you look at Exodus 3:20, Yahweh tells Moses that he will smite Egypt, and Israel will not come out of Egypt empty-handed. This is a promise that's given to Moses in Exodus 3:20. But the original promise that was originally given to Abraham, and that was given in Genesis 15:14, where Yahweh states that after 430 years, Israel will be delivered in the 4th generation. I'm just going to say a quick welcome here to you guys. I'm so glad you found us again with the new link. Sorry we had to transition, but I was apparently had swallowed a chipmunk earlier this evening. So with the new settings, we're now back on track. So we find that with the covenant, Yahweh had originally told Abraham that in 430 years, in the 4th generation, your children will come out with a great substance and come out of the nation of Egypt. We also, they didn't say Egypt particularly, but it says that nation will I judge, and afterwards they will come out with great substance. He reiterates this promise to Moses. And then we find later on, it's right around Exodus 11, Exodus 12, Moses tells the people of Israel, he says, go and borrow objects of wealth from all your Egyptian neighbors. And later on, the account in Exodus states that that Israel utterly plundered the Egyptians. So you find that there's consistency. And even if you subscribe to different documentary hypotheses, these hypotheses do not impinge the integrity of the story that is being told, because each and every author, whether you go through the J, the P, or the E, they're all confirming the same story and the same history. So that's very interesting when we're looking at validity issues. The other thing that I just wanted to touch on, because I don't go into it in a lot of depth here, but there is a controversy in Exodus 12, verse 40, with whether or not the 430 years meant that Israel would be in Egypt for 430 years, or whether that time period refers to the time that Abraham enters into Canaan until Israel's deliverance out of Egypt. When you go to the ancient texts and you go to the ancient scholars, you really find that there is a division. Some side with the Masoretic text with the 430 years. Some side with Demetrius and Josephus and the Samaritan text, which state that it's only 215 years, where there was 215 years inside the land of Canaan, and then only 215 years within Egypt. And then that allowed Israel to come out of Egypt in that fourth generation from, I think it would have been from Jacob. So there is that controversy. I'm not going to say tonight which one I believe is the better choice as far as interpretation, but I am working on an article that I should have posted hopefully in the next few weeks that presents some evidence and leads some credibility as to which of those scenarios better fits the historical evidence and archaeology that we have at present. So we continue on, and we find that in Exodus 20:18, that Yahweh has again descended upon the entire mountain with this incredible scene that is supposed to make an impression on the entire nation of Israel. And we find that when Yahweh speaks, you know, the stipulations of the Sinai covenant are the same as what they were for Abraham. Yahweh said, you know, obey my voice, keep my commandments, obey my statutes, judgments, and laws. This is reiterated in in Exodus 20, verses 18, but we also find that's the same thing that is said to Abraham in Genesis 26, verse 5. So there's no change in God. I mean, God is very constant. He's very much says the same thing from one generation to another generation. We can have 5, 6, 8, 12, 15, 1,000 generations later. It's still the same message, and it's still the same doctrine, and it's still the same truth. And so we also find, I'm going to grab a sip if y'all can't tell. The chipmunk may have gone away, but I'm still fighting a little cold here. We also find that when Yahweh says, obey my voice, he's not referring to something that you hear personally, perhaps in your conscience or in your own mind or in your, you know, within yourself. When Yahweh says, obey my voice, he is always referring to something that's physically and audibly spoken. When Abraham, with the burnt offering covenant and the slaying of Isaac, that angel that cried out and that stopped Abraham was something that was physically spoken. It was a very physical covenant. All of the covenants were audibly spoken covenants. The same with Israel. It is audibly spoken. So when Yahweh says, obey my voice, when he says that to the nation of Israel, he's referring to the 10 commandments that God himself spoke at Mount Sinai. So that is, to me, is something that provides a lot of credibility to the text and a lot of consistency. And again, it makes the whole entire covenant very real as far as a constitutional document is concerned. It's spoken and then it's written. We also find that, the entire nation is brought under this covenant. So this would be not just Israelites, it would also be their descendants are part of this covenant. So what exactly is the Sinai covenant? The Sinai covenant is specifically the 10 commandments. Now, let me distinguish something here, because the 10 commandments that are written on stone by the hand of God, those are the constitution, and they are the philosophies, the subjects, if you would, or the categories for the constitution that Yahweh made with Israel. The law of Moses tells us how to apply them. Now, with that, there is the possibility, as Jeremiah brings out in Jeremiah 31, that these can be applied differently when life and during a different age and a different time. But the philosophies, the foundation, everything that is a principle will not change. It will all stay the same. So what's an example? Perhaps the building a fence around the roof of your home, which is one stipulation within the law of Moses. That isn't a factor today, simply because we do not have highways on our roofs anymore. We don't really walk from roof to rooftop where people would fall off. However, we do build balconies. So while we would not put a fence around our roof, we would put a fence around a balcony to keep people from following, and we would try to avoid negligence. So that is a very scriptural paradigm. The other thing that we find is that this covenant is reiterated. It doesn't matter if it's at Sinai or with the next generation, that would be after the people died in the wilderness and that their children supplant them and they are the ones that inherit the land. The stipulations are the same. It's still based on those 10 precepts, those 10 ideas. And again, the law of Moses gives us a paradigm, gives us the statutes, judgments, and laws in a very detailed way so that we know and we have concrete examples on how to apply them to day-to-day life and to a civil government. This is really a treatise on civil government and how to properly affect it and administrate it. I'm going to grab another glass of water here. I don't want to start coughing. Now, remember that every single covenant has a sign. The Noah covenant, the sign was the rainbow. The Promised Land covenant was Abraham leaving Mesopotamia and going into Canaan. The burnt offering covenant was the symbolic sacrifice of Isaac. Circumcision covenant, it was circumcision. So what is the sign of the Sinai covenant? We find in Exodus 31 that the Sabbaths are the sign that you are in compliance with the Sinai covenant. Now, if you look at Leviticus 23, the first sign is the weekly Shabbat, or the weekly Sabbath. So that is the very first sign of the covenant, but it's not the only one. We find that all the holy days are Shabbats, they're Sabbaths, and keeping those holy days, those feast times, are part of being a part of that sanctified people. And it's part of showing that you are in compliance and that you are in covenant with Yahweh. So, God doesn't leave you wondering, am I doing right? He doesn't leave you in this state where you're always wondering if you are accepted in his sight, if you are right and pleasing. He gives you concrete things that you can do that are actually very easy, that you know that you are in compliance. So that's something that I think is reassuring. At least I know it is to me. And those Sabbaths that you enjoy are such a tremendous blessing. They're a blessing simply because they provide a time of fellowship, a time of renewing the covenant, a time of uplifting and of renewal for us as a society, as well as a community, and a time to come together. For us, we did attend a Sukkot in Tennessee. It was phenomenal. We met a lot of wonderful people, new people, and I hope everyone will come back again next year. We have not set a place for next year, but we are going to begin looking here in the next week or so. And it was just such a rejuvenating time to sit down, to fellowship, to hear each other's stories. You know, when you, I don't know about you guys, but when I hear other people's journey, it really, you know, helps me say, oh, we're not alone. And also the fact that to have all these other people that are kind of waking up and seeing the same thing. Some of these people have never heard of, you know, the other groups that exist out there, or roots of faith, or anything, but yet they are seeing and they are awakening. And look at this. It's amazing how God is bringing us all together. The internet is just a phenomenal blessing, and allowing us even tonight to be able to have discussions and to be able to fellowship together. So I do encourage you guys, if you can, to enjoy a Sukkot together, because those sanctified times are just very refreshing and very rejuvenating. This year, the Sukkot that we hosted did not have internet. I think this is the second year now where the campground has said, yes, we have internet, and we get there, we find that things aren't as promised. So I believe there has been a volunteering of next year perhaps supplying some sort of satellite feed that where we can upload, and you guys can hopefully be live with us next year if you cannot make it. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. So continuing now with the Moab Shechem covenant, we find that the sign of the Moab Shechem covenant has changed a little bit. Where with the Sinai covenant, the sign of compliance is keeping the Shabbats, keeping all the holy days. The sign of compliance with the Deuteronomic covenant becomes that it is in your heart and it is in your soul. So that when you think in accordance with the Moabic and the Sinai covenants. You desire those things that are in the covenant. You don't want to steal. So it goes beyond the fact that you're just not going to do it. It goes to the fact that you don't want to do it. Same thing with keeping the Shabbat. You're not keeping it out of compulsion. You're not keeping it because you have to. You're not doing any of these things that are written in the law because you have to. You're doing them because you desire it and because you want to. And that becomes the sign of compliance of the Moab Shechem covenant. So we're just going to go through these, and I'm now on page 150. And if you'll bear with me, my cough is starting to flare up because I'm talking too much. You find that the Moab Shechem covenant is really a recovenanting. He is offering to this generation that came out of Egypt. He's offering to their children the same covenant that he offered to their forefathers. And God is always very careful to recite the history. He wants Israel to remember their history and to not forget it. So he's very careful with his covenants to say, you know, I am the God of your fathers. I brought you out of the land of Egypt. And he reiterates this history to them so that he knows this is not something new. Hey, Alicia. I might have to get my daughter to give me a cough drop. If I have to cut it short tonight, we'll kind of work this in next week. So we find that, again, what is reiterated are the 10 precepts. We also find another, sorry guys, another injunction is added to the Moab Shechem covenant. And that injunction is a constitutional amendment that we should not add or take away from that constitution. So this is a protection to the people so that later generations cannot come in and change the covenant that Yahweh has made with his people. So hold on, guys. I'm going to find a cough drop here real quick. Okay. Hopefully that'll take care of things. So we find that this constitutional amendment, which prevents later generations from adding to or taking away from the covenant, protects the people. It prevents the priesthood from usurping greater authority than what has been delegated to it. It prevents the monarchy from failing to uphold the Constitution. So we find that in every single instance, God is wanting to establish liberty on the land for the people. He does that by giving them a land that is free. He gives them that through a constitution that teaches them how to remain free. Very similar and very cogent with American history as we know it. Again, with the Deuteronomy covenant, it's the idea that if you do this, then this will happen. Sorry, guys. We also find that the curses, and we're not going to get into so much of the testimonial law tonight, which are the blessings for compliance and the curses for non-compliance. We will be getting into that in chapter 14. So, and that what we will find is that these curses form a chronological prophecy. It begins for the first time in the Judges era, and it started again in the monarchy era. And we find that these curses define a prophetical law for Israel's future. And we'll look at that in greater detail when we come to chapters 13 and 14. So what I wanted to go over tonight, a couple other things, are if you will look at page 153, where we have that each covenant is ratified by something very in particular. Sorry, guys. The Sinai covenant is ratified by Passover. The Moab Shechem covenant is, even though these people, this generation that supplanted those that came out of Egypt, even though this generation covenants with Yahweh outside the promised land, the Deuteronomy covenant is not activated until Israel comes into the land and until they place the blessings on Mount Ebal and the curses on Gerizim. So until these is actually activated, and what has to happen for this? Joshua and Israel's armies have to basically carve a path from Jericho all the way to Shechem, because Shechem, the city of Shechem, lied at the base of Gerizim and Ebal. And you find that once the ceremonial placing of the curses on the people at this point in time, once that occurs, that is what activates the covenant. And that's what makes it ratified. And it is at that point that Israel begins to become established on the land so that they can follow it and so that they can establish administrative centers within their land for self-governance. You also find that this constitution is something that is there for successive generations, not just for those that immediately come in the land, but it's designed to be adaptable, a living constitution in the fact that it doesn't change for each generation or for new situations, but rather the precepts are broad enough to be universally applied to many new and different situations as they arise. So again, every covenant is ratified by something, whether it's sacrifice or whether it's placing of the curses. It is ratified by something. Now, as we go from the national covenants into individual covenants, I wanted to get into what a covenant of light is, because throughout Scripture, you hear this idea of a covenant of light, and we really hear it more with David. Sorry. We hear it more with David than what we really do with Phineas. And throughout the prophets, it is said that Yahweh would not bring judgment on Solomon for the sake of David, whom he had promised to give a light to. And what we find, covenants of light establish peace treaties between God and humanity. These peace treaties establish that if a person, a house, because this really extends beyond the individual. But if a house, meaning an individual and their children, depart from the way of Yahweh, he will not allow a holocaust to utterly destroy that household. And this was important, especially in roles of leadership, where in ancient times and even often today, when one regime falls, their entire household is often put to death. Look at Gaddafi. Look at, oh, why did my mind just went like, Saddam Hussein. A lot of these people, when their houses fall, the entire house is put to death so that there is no threat of that house ever gaining power or control again. So the covenants of peace that God offers to both David and Phineas, and we'll see other people in Israel's history, offer this mercy extended to their household, where even though there is war, even though there is judgment that comes for their sins, for their oppression of others, even though that occurs, their children are still going to survive. Their children, there will still be children alive in the latter-day congregation of Israel at the time of the restoration. So that is what these covenants of peace do. Interestingly, you know, remember with the Abrahamic covenant and with the circumcision covenant that Yahweh within the circumcision covenant covenanted with Sarai. So God does not exclude women at all from his covenants, and they play a very important part throughout Israel's history. This is especially true with Sapphira and Puah, who, if you will remember, at the time of the Exodus, well, I'm sorry, at the time of the birth of Moses, Pharaoh said, when the Hebrew women give birth, please, you know, dispose of their children. These women refused to do that. They honored Yahweh, they honored their people, and because of that, Yahweh made covenants with these women and promised them sure houses. He gave them a covenant of light. Now, the text does not state it is a covenant of light. However, when you look at it in context of a sure house is always a covenant of light, meaning that they will have children in the latter days. Yahweh was also not partial where foreigners were concerned, because we also find that Jonadab ben Rechab also was extended the same covenant. So it was even there among foreigners. And again, the idea of a covenant of light is that the children of those people will not be exterminated. They will be around in the latter days. And it's very interesting because this covenant of light, it was offered to particular people, mainly ruling houses within Israel's society. But it was never offered to the people of Israel. A covenant of life was never offered on a national level. But we find in Jeremiah and in Isaiah that the final covenant that Yahweh makes with the people of Israel at the restoration is actually a covenant of light. It is a covenant that promises promises mercy when they rebel, that promises chastisement in measure. And because Israel is committed to this way and does not depart from it, some of these greater judgments that we're seeing even in the world today do not occur because they're committed to this way of life that preserves and protects them. So this does complete chapter 4. This completes the look at the covenants. Next week we will begin chapter 5, and I believe we go to, let me give you, we go to page 169 for next week. So that'll be 159 to 169, I believe, because I don't think we got into Holy Nation. Yeah. So that will be the division for next week. And please, any questions that you guys have, please post your questions. And I look forward to seeing you guys next week. And hopefully my hacking cough will be gone by then. So it's been great spending Shabbat with you all. And if you have any questions or comments, just write them down and we'll go over it. And then we'll see you again next week. We have about 3 weeks until we take a break, because we will not be meeting November 6th or November 30th. I'm sorry, November 6th and 13th, because I will be in Israel. So we will skip those 2 weeks, but otherwise we have 3 weeks until then. Any questions? It's been great fellowshipping with you guys tonight. And I'm glad the chipmunk gone, but it appears that the cough took the chipmunk's place. So let's see, I'm going to type. So, all right. Well, if there are no questions, I'm going to go ahead and shut down the broadcast, and we will see you again next week. Please join us tomorrow morning at Roots of Faith at 10:30 Central, and we will fellowship there, and I look forward to seeing you guys there. Have a wonderful evening. Shabbat Shalom.